Good morning, everybody. I'm Cathy Nutbrown, President of Early Education, and I want to thank you first of all for joining us. It's the most beautiful sunny autumn day here in Sheffield. I hope that's the case for you wherever you are. A bit of sunshine makes all the difference, I think. I'm going to first of all introduce the panel, who probably need no introduction, but I'll do that in any case. Liz, I wonder if you could turn on your, there she is. Hi, Liz. So first of all, my colleague at Sheffield, Professor Elizabeth Wood. We have Nathan Archer from Leeds Beckett University, Laura Henry-Allain, who has now become popular with children on CBeebies, as well as many of us in her professional development opportunities. And Nancy Stewart was recently project lead for our Birth to 5 math morning. I've asked the panel if they'll help us get going and stimulate our thinking by just talking for a few minutes about the burning issues that are on their mind at the moment. So I'm going to begin, if I might, with Laura. Laura, can I ask you for your thoughts?
I knew you was going to say that. I knew you was going to say me. Good morning, everybody, and apologies in advance. My voice is a bit croaky. I've been fighting the awful virus that's been going around for about 10 days now, and it's still not shifting. So you're very welcome, and thank you in advance for giving up your Saturday morning, your precious time. For me, I suppose the burning issues, there's quite a lot. I think we're still dealing with the effects of the pandemic, and I'm sure some of my other panel colleagues will allude to that. I'm seeing that from settings across the UK, hearing those particular stories. But for me, over the last, I suppose, 18 months, how we've embraced within the early years, having open and frank discussions around race and racism and bringing that into our conversations. I know it's included within Birth to 5 matters and development matters, etc. But I'm still quite shocked in terms of how I think colleagues understanding what do we mean by race within early years. And recently with my new book, a couple of colleagues have shared it, and a few people in education have come back and not fully having an understanding about what it means. And for instance, a couple of brief case points there, you know, saying that we can discuss racism, but we're not allowed to talk about white people or black people. And to me, we need to do that. And one of the colleagues that posted was celebrating the book and celebrating the work that some colleagues are doing within racism. When somebody else posted the particular comment to say, well, no, it's racist to do it, I said, well, how can you say that something is racist, discussing racism? But then when I messaged that colleague and I said, well, I thank that colleague for actually saying that, because other people are probably saying it and not posting it out on a public forum. So I think that the challenge, the action point to us is how can we continue with our conversations around race and racism? Because of all of us know, I know I'm preaching to the converted, children shape their minds and their brains within the first 5 years. And I hear stories from parents and from early educators and teachers that children as young as 3 or 4 have made racist comments. So where is that coming from? So within the early years, we have a really good, fantastic window of opportunity to make that difference. And I always call it the 3 L's. How are we leaning in? What are we learning? How are we listening to people like myself of colour who've had those lived experiences? And what are we doing in terms of our reading and our research against, you know, empowerment, race, racism, how it affects many different communities. And I include there communities like the Gypsy, Roma and travelling communities as well, because sometimes they don't form part of our conversations. And that's been my learning over the last few years, and the LGBTQ plus community. I remember once I went into a setting, this was only 2 years ago, and they still had on their admission for mum and dad, you know, and it's little things like that. And I think we all owe it to the children and families that we work with to be proactive and to continue our conversations. I say it's a journey, and I'm learning every day myself. And that's me sliding off my soapbox.
Cathy, you just need to unmute again.
Sorry. Laura, I was just saying that I disappeared for a moment because my machine decided to reconnect. But one of the things I'm taking away from what you've said is the need to think outside our own boxes. So thank you for starting us off this morning. Can I go next to Professor Liz Wood, please? Liz, do you want to give us your few thoughts this morning?
Thank you, Cathy, and good morning, everybody. I have lots of burning issues, as always, but I'm just going to focus on one because this is one of the areas that I'm researching at the moment with colleagues in Sheffield, Louise Kay, and with colleagues at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. So the focus I've chosen is on leadership in early childhood education because it is such a problematic area. And the one of the core concepts that we're working with in this project is the notion of responsibilization of educational leaders in early childhood. And those of you who are EYTs or designated leaders will know that you have to be responsible as leaders of curriculum and pedagogy, as leaders of policy and vision, leaders of people, and you might also have leadership of your own age phase or your own room. Leaders are also responsibilized for ensuring quality, raising standards, and for ensuring equity and inclusion. Now that seems to me like a massive kit bag of responsibilities, and it's taking us, it's a very interesting time for us to be working with the data to tease out all of those different strands. But at the same time that leaders are responsibilized in early childhood, they are also working in very diverse settings and with the structural problems that still exist in the field, such as high turnover of staff, low pay, poor working conditions, and I won't labour on those, but we all know about them. So all of these expectations that policy has of educational leaders, we've created a sort of image of the educational leader in the early years foundation stage as the heroic leader. And all of those responsibilities they carry out and all of those expectations are regardless of the multiple factors that lie within wider societies such as poverty, discrimination, low wages, mental and physical health of families and now whole communities, housing, the list goes on. And again, you're all going to be familiar with those. So what we're trying to do in this project and on behalf of the field is to look at new and alternative definitions of leadership in early childhood education. And what we're focusing on is rather than these heroic personal qualities and attributes of the educational leader, we are looking at the capacity of leaders to effect changes in their settings and to build the capacity of their teams. We're also exploring the concept of the educational leader as a responsible agent and an agent of change, based on the professional values, morals, and commitments that exist within the field. So that is just one of my burning issues. And as many of you will also know, another of my burning issues, which I'm not going to talk about today, is the direct interference of Ofsted into all areas of early childhood education. But that's another topic.
Thank you, Liz. And I guess now our leaders are going to have to lead recovery as well. So thank you for your thoughts on that this morning. I'm going to go to Nathan next. Nathan, can you give us your thoughts, please?
Sure. Morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to join the panel today. I have two key issues, if you'll permit me. I wanted to talk about the funding, and I want to talk about workforce development. So to take funding, first of all, I think we've seen some really profound changes in the infrastructure, the landscape of provision, and without being overly depressing about this, I think it's really important that we reflect on children's centre closures, on the reduction in the number of childminders, and also the sort of fragility, the precarity with which both maintained nursery schools and private and voluntary settings are operating at the moment. So for me, the main cause of those is how services are funded or underfunded. And although there has been some commitment to funding through the comprehensive spending review, I think there'll continue to be a shortfall between what's paid and what's needed to deliver those services across all of that provision. Many people will be familiar with the Freedom of Information request that the Early Years Alliance recently secured, and that shows the scale of that gap in funding across all of the sector, based on the DfE's own calculations. And I think it's really important that we kind of keep that story alive. Actually, it's really important to underscore the DfE's own calculations are that they are underfunding provision. And the second point, sort of associated with that, is the lack of support for the workforce. And I would argue that we're currently in a phase of policy neglect around the early childhood workforce. So the last national strategy was 2017, so that's almost 5 years ago now. And as Elizabeth and Laura have alluded to, we're seeing poor terms and conditions for the workforce, and I feel that that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So lots of missed opportunities to highlight and develop a qualifications infrastructure and associated career pathways. I think it is important to acknowledge that there has been some investment in CPD, professional development recently, but that's very much driven by the Department for Education's priorities. And as a result of that, it's a very fragmented set of initiatives. And I think it's less responsive and less locally customised than it might be. So for me, this long-term strategy around developing the workforce is really lacking. But I think there have been opportunities for resistance and hope as well, and I think it's really important to reflect on those. So the Birth to Five Matters document that came out earlier this year, which was expertly led by Early Education and coordinated by Nancy, I think is a wonderful example of cross-sector collaboration. It's a huge undertaking and testament to the solidarity and hard work of lots of people in the sector. So really important to acknowledge and celebrate those moments. But I'd really like to see a coalition of organisations come together around these two issues of funding and workforce in the same way. So on that, I remain ever hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. And you're talking about investment, aren't you? And if you want anything good, then it needs proper investment. Thank you very much. Nancy, can I ask you to give us your thoughts this morning, please?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Being invited to talk about one burning issue is so difficult, and we've already heard several. Wouldn't it be great if we could talk about burning issues which are positive and everything's going wonderfully? Will we ever get to that point in early years where we don't feel beleaguered by so many challenging and negative forces or neglect, as Nathan says? But the bit I've chosen, the one out of many possibles, really leads on from what Liz commented on in terms of Ofsted interference, direct interference, particularly in the area of how we understand and work with curriculum. I've been very troubled by the confused messages, but also the enormous pressure on settings and professionals to try to organize their understanding in a way that suits the way Ofsted wants to look at it. Although we, on the one hand, are being told nothing needs to be in writing, in practice, people are being pressured to produce and speak from detailed progression maps that need to go all the way through into primary. So primary teachers are asking, well, what are you doing in the early years that will help them to do geography in Key Stage 1, not understanding the foundational nature of what early years is about. So on the one hand, we're told very clearly, learning is not linear. And we get that message through all kinds of official pronouncements, and yet they're asking for a linear curriculum in small step detail, as if children are not going to be making unexpected connections and are going to make leaps, and that we're getting rid of the workload issue, which the DFE has said is a primary purpose of the reforms. So we'll reduce workload by saying you don't need to record all this in terms of assessment, but the workload is expanded enormously by recording the teaching. You know, what is our expectation of what will be taught? So we substitute one checklist for another. So learning isn't linear, but our teaching must be, is the message we're getting. So confused, affects the workload. I'm also very concerned with what the sense of the content of the curriculum is meant to be. We've had from Ofsted a lot of emphasis on knowledge, defined as what children remember. So it's facts, it's content in that sense. And yet I would argue that a lot of what our curriculum in the early years is not about what they remember, pieces of information. It is, to be truly foundational, for one thing, it is in those prime areas. And you don't teach knowledge about being emotionally healthy person who makes connections with others. You don't teach knowledge really in communication and language, however much they are tending to put it down to vocabulary, which is a teachable thing in some sense. Communication and language is about listening and attention. It's about comprehension by making links. It's about being woven into all of your experiences. So it's far too narrow in that sense. And physical development, all of these, and hugely the characteristics of effective learning, which are foundational, are not taught as things to remember. They are lived. And our curriculum should be around opportunities and experiences that we give children. I think the emphasis has moved away from development, which we want to support children's development, and onto learning, which goes with teaching and a taught curriculum. And I think that is very negative and very limiting of the way we look at early childhood.
Thank you, Nancy. And to a great extent, that's about trusting professionals to see what children are doing and decide how to challenge them next and support them. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that has stimulated in those of you who are here some questions. But in the first instance, I'm going to go to Verity Campbell-Barr, who's down in the southwest. Verity, would you like to unmute, put your camera on and ask your question, please?
Morning all. Oh, there we go. Oh, no, you'd think by now we'd got used to all of this technology, wouldn't you? I'm sure this happens to me in every meeting. Thank you very much. I feel like I've got more questions now, having heard the little presentations, but the one I submitted in advance was related to the funding question. So we continuously ask for more funding in early years. And of course, I completely agree that we need more funding. But I also know from my own meetings with the Department for Education that the chances of the funding coming through in the rates that we would like it to are very unlikely. So therefore, what do you think might be the non-economic solutions for the future viability of early childhood education and care?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Nathan if you would respond to that, and then if other panel members have something they would like to add, please do. Before you start, Nathan, Liz, can I ask you to put your camera on and unmute yourself? Thank you. Nathan.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for that question, Verity. It's a really good question, and I wonder if I could perhaps answer it in two parts and cheat slightly and offer a slightly different economic solution, because I think there are funds within the system that are not being utilised. So colleagues may be familiar with the child care tax-free childcare system, and apparently that is underclaimed by hundreds of millions of pounds. I can't remember the exact figure, but clearly that's an issue either of access to that funding by parents to claim it, or a design issue. So there's some barrier to explain why that funding is not reaching the front line. So in the short term, that funding could be better deployed to meet that cost of offering early education. So there's an immediate and perhaps short-term solution that could be made there. Perhaps the bigger question is how we think about early education and care. And at the moment, clearly, there's an agenda to frame this as childcare for working parents. And as a result, we have a lot of demand-side funding schemes rather than supply-side. And I think if early education were to be framed as a public good, and funding shifted towards a more supply-side funding stream, then we might get a more sustainable solution in the long term. I don't know whether that answers the question, but that's my initial thoughts.
No, thank you. I think particularly what you're saying about the efficiency of the use of funds is really important. Yeah, definitely something we can feed back very clearly.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Verity. I'm just wondering about how this issue pans out regionally. Is there anyone from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland who'd like to give us their perspective on that question? Okay, well, maybe you'd like to come in later on. Anybody else on the panel want to add to what Nathan said?
I think possibly a contentious area is in terms of the private-public mix. I am certainly not an expert on the funding systems and the finance of early childhood, and I've been very impressed with people who have come up with some other possible models. Looking at the way things, for instance, are done in Scandinavia, as we all so often turn there. But it does trouble me that we have a lot of private investors who are paying dividends, and there is a lot of money coming out of early childhood to support businesses and profit making. And it would seem to me, in the same way that we say, are private schools entitled to be charities, what really is the public good, that we should consider whether there is something askew when people are making profits out of something which should be seen as a public good. And that may be politically contentious, but you know, I do think it's could be part of the difficulty.
Thank you. If anyone has a question on this topic or anything else that the panel have said, or indeed anything that you brought with you in your own hearts and minds this morning, just raise your hand or put your camera on and ask away. We could talk amongst ourselves. Di Chilvers, you've always got a question or a thought. Do you want to?
Thanks, Cathy. Yeah, I've got many questions. I don't know if anyone can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah, because I am in Devon. It's a long way to travel, and I do have to go in a few minutes. But it's really difficult because I do want to hear what everyone's got to say. I think my questions are very much around what Elizabeth's saying in terms, and Nancy particularly around the whole issue of leadership and so on, but also how on earth do you make sense of what Ofsted is saying? Because yet again, I did post something in the chat just now. I listened to the LED event on Wednesday, which was rammed, absolutely rammed with people, and messages being given by Ofsted in a very dictatorial way. It was read off a sheet of paper, and the tone actually really surprised me, the tone of their delivery, and I think the language that they were using. So I made copious notes to capture the exact language that they are using. But yet again, we had another definition of the curriculum. So I've lost count now, Liz. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you know how many definitions there have been of the curriculum from Ofsted. I'd be very interested to know, because their muddled thinking is the big issue. And also portraying Ofsted's myths, portraying these things as myths, and that it's the people, it's us that have got it confused, and that we are creating these myths, which then Ofsted has to myth bust. But it's not surprising, is it, when, as you say, there are so many confused messages, people don't know what they're doing. I mean, I just wonder what the panel's thoughts are about how we should tackle Ofsted on this, because there is some discussions going on at the moment that it does need addressing. Julie Fisher did address a particular instance about the progression maps to Jill Jones probably quite a few months ago now, and we had an answer from Jill Jones about that. But as people have said, it's completely, she's saying one thing and there it is in another. So, and it's very clear that there is this opposition of what they're saying in their own narratives. So I don't know what people think we should do. I'm just interested in sort of if there is some way. I mean, we have some thoughts around this, some of us already, about what we do, because it's gone on long enough now, this, and people out there in the sector are really confused and thinking, oh, well, we better do what Ofsted says, because otherwise we're going to get judged. So I just wondered what people thought about as a way forward.
Thanks, Di. I just want to hold on to that for one moment before I ask the panel to comment, because Monica Hingarani, you had your hand up a little while ago.
Thanks, Cathy. Yeah, and it follows really from what Di was saying and the panel, which it's been lovely to come and listen. Actually, I'm quite new to the national setup, but I'm active locally in Leicester, and I think I love the idea of the wisdom in the room, and I loved all the mention about kind of values-led stuff that I've heard this morning. I really feel that you're my friends, although I hardly know you. And I think the conversations are nuanced, but I have to say, I went into early years teaching, having already had children of my own, and I kept thinking as a reception teacher that these children are actually my children now. And what I was being asked to do, as people were saying, Ofsted would want you to do this, I kind of had to look in my heart really and say, would I do this with my own children? And I think, you know, what's really valuable for me when I work with policy and I sit across the table from lots of people who think they're very important, is to think, actually, what would I do with my own children? Where are the voices of my local community, and how can I carry them in such that actually my community is the locus of learning for me, and the families that I worked with as a teacher gave me strength, actually. And everything that I've heard that's been values led has made me sort of feel excited this morning that I'm in the right place and with brilliant people who have got really very nuanced understandings, and together we are that coalition, aren't we? And actually, where are the voices of families? Where are the voices of the child in this? Because they're the things that make me want to come and join you on a Saturday morning. It might just be because I've done parkrun and I feel particularly adrenaline pumping, but I just want to thank you for the nuance. It is about the wider circumstances. Laura made so many valuable points right at the beginning. I felt so excited, Laura, to meet you. You're all my heroes and sheroes, but you know, together I think we've got these answers. Just wanted to contribute that. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. If I can summarise, forgive me, Monica, if I'm not putting this together correctly, but what I've got from you, building on what Di said, is how we can challenge, build and support values. Like, I wonder if the panel might give us their thoughts on putting children to the forefront of values-led practice, which then challenges Ofsted interference.
Can I respond to that, Cathy? Because I think we have to be very careful about asking practitioners to engage in overt resistance to Ofsted unless it is through organisations such as Early Education. In the project we're doing on educational leadership, the settings that we identified in Australia have a working towards rating, which is our Ofsted equivalent of requires improvement. And one of the key findings is the huge emotional and existential impact that a low inspection rating has upon individuals, and then the messages that that sends about the setting and the staff within it to parents and to the local community, such that parents may well withdraw their children from a setting that has had a low inspection rating. So I think that then begs the question of, where does resistance come from? Nobody in Ofsted is going to read the paper that I wrote, deconstructing their intervention in early childhood. We know as academics that we are dismissed by Ofsted. So therefore, I think we need much more critical conversations in our own field. And I really appreciate the strength of feeling about representing the voice of the child. But I also think we need to be having our own critical conversations and really raising the intellectual bar in terms of, so what is curriculum? What does curriculum mean in early childhood education? How do we enact forms of pedagogy that respond to diversity and equity and inclusion? So I think our resistance can come through different pathways.
Thank you, Liz. Laura, you raised your hand there.
I did, and I don't think I know how to take it off. I'll work that out in a minute. Yeah, just wanted to come in really with some of the thoughts. I've been really reflecting on what everybody has said so far, and it's just been really inspiring. And Monica, thank you for sharing your thoughts, because I always feel that we need to link back into what's going on at the shop floor level. And as an example of that, I was in a school on Thursday, I can't remember what day it was, and I put it off because they need my books for anti-bullying week. And when I was I only put like 15 minutes into me, it was meant to run the books in and go back again. But the head said, "Oh, I've been waiting for you to come so long. I want to show you my school." And I'm like, okay then. And 2 hours later, and for me, when I left, I was super emotional because nobody in that school, none of the teachers mentioned Ofsted. Nobody mentioned the Department of Education. Everything was about the children. I was talking to the children. We had conversations, you know, because St. Lucia, where Jojo and Gran Gran is based on, they speak Creole. Children were there the child from Guadeloupe, from Martinique. There was a child from, you know, somewhere in Ghana, from India, and all of these rich conversations about them and their families. And I think for me, that's what it needs to come back to, that here is a school that I don't know if Ofsted was to go in next week, what they would be graded out. But to me, this is what I want to see in terms of the children, the family, the community, what they did within lockdown, supplying food, you know, how they extend into it's a real community school. And the staff team were diverse. She was a black head teacher, and everybody there, the welcome from the reception staff. And the point I want to be making about, you know, Ofsted, for me, it's the interference, and sometimes I cry when I see, you know, the reports that come up, the frustrations from colleagues. And is there not a conversation to be had? Should we just get rid of the grades? Because that's what it is. And I think Elizabeth was saying, if a school or a setting gets inadequate or requires improvement, the local shame that's on that school, you know, it has an impact on funding if you're an early years setting. So should we not then, should our battles, when we're thinking about, okay, what battles do we need to be fighting here? Should it not be, let's just get rid of that grading? Because a school like that I saw was just so magical. And I'm sure if an inspector went into that school, or inspectors rather, they would probably find so many different things that I wouldn't say so.
Thank you.
Let's get rid of the
I fully agree with Laura. Yes, hello. I fully agree with Laura's suggestion, and have for a long time thought maybe I should try to get to grips with what actually is the legal remit of Ofsted, and how did they come to have the role that they have. Their inspection, should inspection be pass or fail? You know, you meet your legal responsibilities, you are allowed to be open. Beyond that, quality, as we all know, is subtle, complex. No one can ever agree on what the definition is and how you should assess it. So why do we have this small group of people who by diktat can decide what quality is this year, which might be different next year and was different last year, and then it's imposed on a whole sector in these extremely onerous ways that have such a weight? I would like to see inspection, something that tells us whether a place is safe and meeting, you know, in a very rounded way, the requirements of the statutory framework. There's nothing about curriculum progression maps in the statutory framework. There's no reason people should be, you know, it's out of the head of Ofsted, and possibly a few other people who are, you know, working on that agenda. But it's not a requirement. And then in terms of quality development, yes, it would be great to have an inspection which is a conversational probing. But what it comes down to is building that professional identity, professional confidence, knowing your values, your community, and being able to build on that. And inspectors can have those conversations, but they should not be then giving you a score based on that. That's a very, very big change. That maybe that's what we should start pushing. You know, it's almost like, what gives you the right? And that's what I would like to ask Ofsted.
Thank you, Nancy. I've just been thinking about the history of inspection, and if we go back to the roots of an idea, we see all sorts of things that can shed some light. And I'm just thinking about Catherine Bathurst, who was the first woman inspector, first woman HMI, whose job it was to look at the education of the very youngest children, the 5-year-olds at the time. And her mission was to make things better for the children. And then more recently, Christian Schiller was an HMI who teachers enjoyed having visit their classrooms. And his mission too was about education for the child. And maybe we need to ask Ofsted to look back at their roots and see where the initial purpose of doing. Any more questions? We'll move on a little bit. Nicola Theobold. Hi, Nicola.
Hello there. Hi, good to see you all. I suppose I should preface this by saying quite happy to take it away from Ofsted, but certainly don't want to move away from Monica's wonderful words and the children, of course. But I was just reflecting on what Nathan was saying in terms of that sort of summary of the context, and in particular the closure of the children's centres. And reflecting on that policy context, and there seems to be this current focus on family hubs and quite a lot of Pathfinder opportunities, grant opportunities to support those, very much suggesting that integrated model of early years services. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? But within this policy context, I'm just wondering how can we retain that focus and emphasis on high quality early education, and bring together some of the agendas, for instance the future of the maintained nursery schools and that strong pedagogical leadership that they provide. How can we bring this all together? Because we know, don't we, that high quality early education is absolutely central to narrowing the gap.
Thanks, Nicola. Laura, do you want to begin first with this one?
Hi, hello Nicola.
Hi.
Thank you for your point. I think I said it all before, to be fair. I don't know. Sorry, Nicola, because I just sort of like switched my brain off for a minute, so I do apologise. I don't have anything. I think you've raised some really, really good points, but I must confess my brain wasn't connecting when you was fully speaking, so I don't have anything to say, so I apologise.
No problem. I realised my camera was off and now put it on.
Nicola, if you want to,
I think it's a Saturday connection.
But Nicola, if you want to just briefly summarise, come out again, and then I can come back.
Sure. I was just reflecting on the policy context really, and the current focus on family hubs and some of the grant funding opportunities that are available for the family hubs, and very much suggesting that integrated model, and how we can just bring, how do we bring this all together to retain the focus on high quality early education within those agendas. For example, how we work with our maintained nursery schools and the role that they can play in providing that very strong pedagogical leadership. I'm not sure if there's an answer. I suppose it's occupying my thoughts quite a lot at the moment. So just was well.
I think it's a good point. I think for me, I'm always quite interested when the DFE come at it in terms of there's always funding available, and but funding for who? Who gets to decide how that funding is equally distributed? How can we make sure that it does target the children and families and community that need that extra additional support? And I think, just sliding away from your point, recently I saw from an email that came through this week, colleagues may need to remind me, there's a new thing around mentors and mentees, and again for me, and there's been some conversations around CPD, but again, who gets to define that in terms of quality? Who gets to choose those individuals? What communities? What's going to be the impact of that? So I think, Nicola, we do need to look at that more carefully and making sure that the funds are targeted where it's actually needed, and actually is it having an impact on those children and families.
Thanks, Laura. Nathan, did you want to comment on
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Nicola. And you raise a really important point about the fact that we've been here before, haven't we? This kind of integrated service infrastructure once existed and doesn't look now quite like it did. But there is an opportunity, I think, to sort of move forward with the Family Hubs agenda. In terms of centering early education in the offer, I think there's been lots of work done by Early Education, the charity, in terms of the value of maintained nursery schools. And there's a recent research paper around that as well that I can forward if it's of interest. But I guess it's about using that evidence at a local level with decision makers to provide that evidence and make sure that the nursery school remains at the centre of an offer. So not a very concrete solution, but we just need to keep shouting loud, I think.
Thanks, Nathan. Anybody else on the panel want to add to that?
I would just was reflecting, having looked at the details around the mentoring program, how at the time that all of the very knowledgeable and detailed support available from local authorities within local authorities, and some very strong local authority teams were being dismantled some years ago, and through funding cuts, I remember thinking, oh, you know, look at the institutional knowledge that's being lost. Look at the expertise in terms of really helping individual settings in their own context, knowing the history of them, knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are, all that gone. And now it's going to, oh, there's a gap has been noticed. And so, yes, we know that the quality of early education really counts. And I do think that policymakers know that and have a strong emphasis there. But it's, well, let's approach it now in a fairly piecemeal way. And it's unfortunate, but at least it, as Nathan says, it's maybe an opportunity, better than nothing. I did notice in the sort of description of the kind of people they're looking for, or what the tasks will be, some of it is supporting settings to use development matters. And I just wanted to mention my view that birth to 5 matters is part of what can help us to develop professional strength, and a sense that we do know what we're talking about, and that we can use this to have those pedagogical conversations with whoever is perhaps suggesting something that we don't always feel is in the best interest of children or their families.
Thank you, Nancy. Just going back to Nicola's thoughts, I was reminded, Nicola, while you were speaking, of work that you, Cathy Silver, did about children's centres, and many children's centres claimed that they were still open, but I think I recall you saying they were little more than an office and a telephone, and directing people to services. So it's what we call things, and what happens when you look behind the label. Is there anything you wanted to say about that, Cathy?
No, I guess I want to say that when the government funded us in Oxford to evaluate the old Children's Centre programme, what we found was that children's centres had a pretty good effect on families and family functioning, but actually not on children's development, because very few of them had high quality education. But we did have a finding that what did improve children's development was attendance at early childhood education elsewhere. So the children's centers were really serving the family. They improved the home learning environment. They improved, I think, maternal mental functioning, but they didn't actually improve children. Children got their improvement in an early childhood center, and that's not surprising, is it? You know, just going to 2 stay and play sessions a week isn't going to change a child. It might really, you know, support and change a family. So I think we really have to go back to early childhood education. And I've really, really enjoyed learning from everybody. This has been a very profound meeting for me. So anyway, I wanted to thank you. And it was a good idea, Cathy.
It was Beatrice's idea. Thank you. This might be the last question, and I think maybe one of the hardest, but this is a question for the panel, and maybe for anyone else to comment on if we have time. And this is about the context of COP26. So to the panel, can I ask each of you to give us your thoughts on what's been happening and the importance of that for early childhood education. So can I go to Liz Wood first of all?
Oh, massive question, Cathy. We need all day on this one.
You have 8 minutes.
Okay, so very quickly, getting to know centres in the area of Melbourne in Australia. One of the standards in the early years learning framework is sustainability. And I think we are seeing through the data that having sustainability as one of those standards actually directs the attention of the leaders and the teams towards what they are doing in the centre and with their children and with their families and communities. And I think, again, a ground level and a community level approach is really important, because we've seen this week, we can't rely on leaders to sort these problems out for us, not least because they've all flown in and flown out. And I'm sure they would all have been travelling at least business class, if not first class. So yeah, community-led focus. We've got a lot to learn from having sustainability as part of our curriculum.
Thanks, Liz. Nathan, can I come to you next?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind for me, and I speak as a former Montessori teacher, is that philosophy of what.
Nathan,
sorry, can you hear me?
Can I come to you next?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, as a sort of former Montessori teacher, I have a particular lens on the issue, and Montessori talks about cosmic education. I think long before we talked about sustainable development. But for me, this is a way of being with children and families and being in the world. So over and above a sort of prescriptive curriculum, I would advocate for this idea of a cosmic education as in terms of how to be with children and support their future.
Thank you. Nancy.
Yes, this is, I think, the major issue presently. And I've been following COP very carefully, partly because as I am moving into retirement and thinking I'm not going to be working directly with practitioners and settings, if I really care about children, what's the most important thing I should be doing is putting my energy into climate emergency and ensuring that they have a future that isn't going to be dire. And so I have become much more involved in local climate action groups as well as national, and finding it's as much a complex area as the early childhood world. So it is something that I have a very strong concern and commitment for. In terms of within our early childhood education, I do think it's essential that it becomes a basic plank of the way we work with children. We are going to need society as a whole to develop understanding and expectations and responsibility, and children growing up with that are going to influence their families, and they are going to be the decision makers of the future. As part of the Nursery World Awards, a couple of years in a row, I've been part of the area I was judging was the Sustainability Award, and a number of settings are doing quality mark for sustainability, and others not necessarily going down that path, but having a real commitment and some stunning work going on where you can see that they are affecting families and children, and the mindset of responsibility for climate justice as well, awareness of the effects on the rest of the world, can be part of what we share with children. And it's heartening to see that come in. Again, Birth to Five Matters, we have some awareness built through, and we looked through understanding the world sections and other areas to make sure that there was enough notice that we need to build that into our work with children. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Laura, can I ask you for your thoughts on the COP issue and the environment?
Yeah, I think I agree with what everybody has said thus far. I think we do still need to do a lot, especially with our children within the early years. I sat my friend's nursery in the summer, which I absolutely loved. And I remember being in the preschool room having lunch and one of the children saying, "No, Laura, that needs to go in the recycling bin." So I think, you know, us as educators, we need to be mirroring that behaviour. And as Nancy was saying, there's a lot of settings and schools are doing some fantastic work. But I think equally too, on a global level, obviously I haven't travelled a lot over the last 20 months or so for a reason, but when I was, and especially from where my parents are from in St. Lucia in the Caribbean, it's classed as a developing country, and they've always done sustainable work because a lot of it is to do with not having the financials. So in terms of growing their own food, selling it within a local market, and you know, what can we do to get those messages across for children so children become sustainability aware. And on a social for a BBC website, they were advocating sensory play and they did the normal thing about food. And I sent a direct message to them and said, well, actually, we need to be having conversations about, you know, as all of us know, preaching to the converted, you can do sensory play without using food. And I think this is a real big conversation that we need to have, and we need to start having it, because I think when I see it plays trays of spaghetti, then the spaghetti is thrown in the bin. What messages are we giving to the environment? What messages are we giving to children and families who are struggling to buy a packet of spaghetti in their local supermarket? So I feel that maybe we do need to do a lot more work. That's the point that I'm trying to make, because I think that, you know, as the cliche, as the song says, the children are the future and the children are going to get it. So we do need to do a lot more work.
Important points there, Laura. Thank you very much indeed. Eileen, Wendy, you had your hand up a second ago. Did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Cathy. I did have my hand up and then I hesitated. And I think it's something to do with being here in Glasgow while COP has been going on, and the huge realization that nothing is going to happen. Like Liz said, we can't rely on our politicians, that nothing's going to happen if we don't do it. But I'm kind of, I'm going to reflect a little bit. I think that's what I'd like to do, if I may, because it ties in with other points that have come up, like why is our CPD so policy implementation focused? What is it about in Scotland, our title, Early Learning and Childcare, where the learning often gets dropped when people talk about it and we talk about ELC? Are we losing sight of that real mix and holistic approach that serves children well? What do parents feel if they already feel a bit stigmatized and they're offered a place in what seems to be care, and they may be reluctant when their other children are off school to be using the 52 weeks that they might be offered as care? There are so many elements, but I think listening to the most recent reflections from the panel about climate and sustainability, I think lots of people don't even know what the word sustainability implies. And I had a most intriguing, and I'd just like to share for a moment, most intriguing 3 sessions at a local centre here with Indigenous people from the Americas, who were talking and sharing about their lifestyle, their attempt to continue growing the crops and looking after the trees that had always served their communities, living in reserves where politicians, particularly in Brazil, were just taking back a whole lot of the reserve land, so they were left with very little. And it kind of was so focusing. And when people in that audience asked, but what can we do here in the West? They said, can you just stop consuming? Could you consume less? Could you try and just consume what you need? And I think in terms of our discussion just now, that has had me very focused on what is it that children and families need from us? And how can educators who don't experience very much agency actually offer that? What about the educator well-being and the educator agency? It's fundamental to being able to offer what we would love to offer to children and families, and to do it with children and families, not to them. So these are reflections, they're not questions, but you know, they're shared issues, aren't they? And I'd like to thank the panel very much. It's been wonderful to sit and listen silently and then catch your gems. But I think there is a whole thing about policy compliance, about leadership, about understanding when we have a curriculum element that says something like knowledge and understanding of the world. That's not getting out a global map and getting children to point where India is, but it's much deeper and richer, and for somebody to do that, they need to have that richness in themselves, and that's a journey. That's a journey that that perhaps early education can help with. So, yeah, I suppose I'd sign up with Nancy on most of the things she said about let's not, and what Liz said, let's not rely on politicians, let's do it ourselves. But how?
Thank you. Thanks, Eileen, Wendy. A perfect end, not just coming back to Glasgow, but a perfect end, a perfect summary of some of the things that we've discussed. It's been a privilege for me to do this morning. Thank you to Ellie, who's been part of the event. I think, Eileen, Wendy, you've just set us the agenda for the next question time, but we'll have to see about that. Thank you so much. There's such a lot to talk about, and I'm really grateful to the panel, to Liz, to Laura, to Nathan, and to Nancy. And thank you to all of you for joining us. So see you at the AGM, and I'll hand back to Beatrice. Ready?
Can I add my thanks to the panelists and also to Cathy for chairing that so ably.